So in this intervention session, I'm going to be looking at 3 key points: keywords, code patterns, and reading exam questions. So keywords are super important. They're important for 3 main reasons. The first one is that some exam questions will use these keywords in their actual explanations. So if you don't know what these keywords mean, you won't understand what the question means, and therefore you won't be able to get the marks. Sometimes exam questions might even ask you what these definitions are. So for example, they might say, what is a variable? And the third one is when you are describing code, when you're trying to explain what a bit of code does, you will want to use these keywords as well to aid your explanation. So that's the 3 reasons we might want to know about keywords. Code patterns are super important as well, because these are how you actually structure your code, and they form templates for you to use in your exam answers. So if you're asked to write an if statement, well, there's a very clear structure to how an if statement is supposed to look. If you need to code a counter control loop, the same idea. So these are just kind of very quick blocks of code which you can adapt to solve the answers, okay? And that links us straight into exam questions, because when we answer exam questions, we need to make use of our keywords and our code patterns in order to solve the problems, okay? So those are the 3 main elements, and we're going to quickly look at all of those now. So for the basic coding questions, here's some of the keywords you need to know about. A variable is a named location in memory used to store a single value. The value can change as a program can run. Okay. For the more advanced coders, a variable can also store an array where it can store multiple values, but that's going to be in a future intervention session. Assignments, when a single value is given to a variable. So when we actually give a variable a value, so when we change a value inside a variable, or we give it a brand new value, we call that assignments. An expression is a series of commands such as operators like adding, subtracting, things like that, which gives us a single value. So for example, I might have 4 plus 5 or 4 plus a. A is a variable. Okay, so anything that returns me a single value, be a number, a text, or even a Boolean value, then that's going to be an expression. Operators, these are things that will perform a calculation, either arithmetic, so plus, minus, times, that kind of thing, or logic, so greater than, less than, and, or, and not. This next set of keywords are to do with the flow of a program. Now, the flow program is basically how that program goes from the start to the end. Think of it a bit like a river. Okay, a river will start at its source and it will flow down all the way to the sea. So, how does your program go from the start of the program and work its way down? Selection is a choice, an if statement. Okay, a choice in code is where we'll have some kind of condition. So it might be A is greater than B, or A is equal to B, or whatever happens to be. And that will either be true or false. If it's true, it's going to do one bit of code. If it's false, then it might do nothing, or it might run an else and do something else. Okay. Iteration, this is where we'll have repetition or a loop inside a code. So it'll run through some instructions, loop back, and do a test. And if that test is true, we'll loop again, come back, loop again, etc., etc. The most common loops that you need to know about are for loops and while loops. We do a lot of work in while loops so far, but the exam might use for loops, but I will be covering that in a pseudocode intervention at a later date. Functions, we haven't studied yet, but it also controls the flow. I'll quickly mention what it is. It's a block of code which performs some kind of algorithm. It takes input in and it returns an output. And what happens is when a function is called, for example, like input, that is a function, it will jump to where that code is in memory, run that code, and then jump back again. Okay, but I will cover functions properly at a later date. There's some data types you need to be familiar with as well for keywords. So casting, this is when we change the data type. So data type is a type data being stored inside a variable. So it might be a number, it might be text, it might be a Boolean value or date, something along those lines. If I want to change a data type, so maybe turn a string into an integer or an integer into a string, or do anything like that, then I must use casting. Casting is the process of turning one data type into another. The common ones that you will come across in the exam are int, short for integer, so casting something to a number, whole number, str or string, casting something to a string, or float, casting something to a float. Casting in the exam isn't as common as you might think it might be, and you can sometimes make assumptions where you wouldn't be able to do that in real coding. So although casting is important for real Python coding, it's not as essential in the exam. Strings, this is text basically. It's a collection of characters all put together in a kind of a string. Data types I've already mentioned. Integers are whole numbers. Reals or floats, those words can be swapped around, are decimal numbers. And finally, Boolean are basically true and false. Code patterns are fundamental to how you should revise coding, okay? Revising coding can seem really difficult to do, but actually it's quite straightforward if you follow the normal patterns of revising. This is what should be on your flashcards, your mind maps, or however you prefer to do things. So here I've got some basic code patterns you need to be familiar with. So how do I get input? Okay, so that's the first one there. A equals input, enter a value. So there's always going to be a question that's always going to be a variable you store the answer into. Okay, one of the most common mistakes I see when I'm marking exam questions is people forget this bit to assign it to a value. Okay, so when you learn and revise this, please make sure you revise the entire thing. It might be worthwhile when you're making notes on this, just labeling up what bits of code do. So for example, we might say this part here asks the question. And the first bit will store the value into a variable so I can use it later. Updating a variable. Now this might seem really super obvious, but notice I have got the same variable here and here. If I want to give the same variable a new value, okay, and that new value is maybe an addition or subtraction of its old one, then this is the thing you have to do. You have to take the current value of the variable, in this case a, add or subtract or multiply whatever you want to do with it, in this case add 4, and then we assign it back to itself. Okay, you see that a lot when you are doing kind of while loops, where you might have something like this, x equals x plus 1. Okay, sometimes when students do this, they forget this part and they just put x plus 1. Okay, so when you're revising this, when you have your code patterns, you must have the x equals x plus 1. I can't write today, x plus 1. Let's pretend that's times by 1. Okay, there we go. Selection. If statements, okay? The key thing to remember about this one is how you write a condition out, okay? In a later one, I'll talk about how to use and or not. For this one, I'm just focusing in on the basics of a single condition, okay? My advice for revising this, if you haven't done this already, is make it very clear what the greater than symbol is, the less than symbol, greater or equal to, because it is very, very common for students to mix those two up in the exam. And obviously, if you mix it up, the if statement is not correct anymore, and you'll lose a mark. Okay, so it's worthwhile revising that. Condition control loops. This is a loop where it might ask you to do something again. Okay, so where you're getting input from the user and it will keep repeating until that input has been met or not met. So in this example, I have a variable starting with yes. Then I say, well, while a is equal to yes, remember double equals is the proper equality check where we're comparing two values together. Then I ask the question inside the loop, and I will do whatever I need to inside that loop. Counter control loops. Now these are super important. This one specifically is one you should learn really well. Okay. The reason why you should learn it really well is because it's probably one you've used a lot when you've been coding your Python. You're probably more comfortable with this type of loop. May or may not be, I don't know, but you should be more comfortable with it. So learning its basics is important. I would strongly advise you annotate this one so you know exactly what is included. Okay, counter control loops are fundamental to programming in the exam. So how does it work? We have a starting point. We have an end point. When does the loop end? So whilst a is less than 10, it's going to loop. As soon as a is no longer less than 10, it's going to stop. We have the code we are repeating. Okay, in this case, just printing A, but in reality, that's probably going to be something a bit more interesting, like getting around a number and displaying it, or adding a maths question, whatever. Then we have our increments. How are you getting from the start to the end? Okay, so that you can think of as a number pattern. So example, the number pattern being produced here is 1, 2, 3, dot, 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 going all the way to 10. If I change that to be plus 2, my number pattern would be this: 1, 3, 5, essentially the odd numbers, 7, dot, 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 and going all the way up. So that is going to be a difference. In the exam, you might see this type of for loop. Okay, you don't have this type of for loop in Python, which is one of the reasons why I don't tend to encourage students to use it when they're writing their code, because it's very hard to obviously test it in Python, because the for loops in Python work very differently. Anyway, this is a counter control loop starting at the value of 1 and going to the value of 9. This essentially, these two are the same loop. Key differences of for loop: you state where it starts and ends directly in the for loop definition. There is no plus 1 because the next A is essentially doing the plus 1. Other than that, it does exactly the same code. Some other code patterns here. If I want to use else if or elif in Python, then this is how I do it. Now, this pattern is actually super important because I see so many students making mistakes on this one. Else if comes immediately after the first if. It is doing another test. So else if must be followed by another test. In this example, we've got C is equal to yellow. Then at the end, we include an else. So think of it this way: it does this first, or is it this? Otherwise, it does this. Okay, that's how you think about it. Condition controlled loops based on input. I've already kind of mentioned this. Here's just the example again. Here I've got a question which is essentially asking, do they want to double again? If they do, then it will run the loop again. If they say no, or actually anything else, it's not going to loop anymore. So these are less likely to come up in the exam. They're much more for the coursework. However, I'll quickly recap them here. A range check is where we're checking to see if a number is between a certain set of values. And if they're not between those values, then we ask again. So I'm wanting a number between 1 and 10. So if the number is less than 1 or is it greater than 10, I just want to ask the question again. Okay, that is a simple range check. Precedence check is when we make sure that the user must enter a value. Simply put, if they enter nothing, we ask for the information again. Okay, as I said, less likely to come up with the exam, much more likely for coursework. One key exam tip I will give you guys is that when you are solving the bigger questions in the exam, you don't need to validate unless they tell you to. Okay, I have seen some students before in the past who've written validation for all the inputs inside the exam question, thinking they're being really clever, thinking they're going to get high marks on that one. However, they're wasting their time because there's no marks available for it unless it really clearly asks you to validate, okay? And it will be really clear in the question.